Aloha, everyone. I'm Chad Harris, and the following presentation is an archetypal astrological analysis of Rudolf Steiner's natal chart and transits for many of the important events in his life that I did for a Rudolf Steiner reading group led by Matt Siegel and Ashton Arnoldy. We are reading Steiner's Philosophy of Freedom, and the first hour or so of the video is the analysis of his natal chart and transits, whereas the last 20 minutes is a pretty in-depth philosophical discussion on the nature of archetypes, the nature of astrological phenomena, karma, fate, free will, that type of thing. So please feel free to leave any questions or comments you may have in the comment section. I look forward to engaging you there and in future videos. So enjoy and be well. And yeah, we're going to start this natal chart. And just to let you know, what we're mainly going to discuss will be the planetary archetypes. These are the planets here on the outer circle. These are the glyphs. If you ever want to know what planet we're talking about, here's the names on this glyph. Can you all see my cursor? And okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. And the grid over here is also listing the same planetary aspects that are listed in the center of the circle here. It just gives you a more precise correlation, and it actually gives the degree of the exactness of the aspect that's at play. And the aspects themselves are in the upper right corner: conjunction, opposition, trine, square, sextile. I won't go too deeply into what trines and sextiles mean, or squares. I mean, I'll touch on it briefly, but it's more important really to know that any two planets are in aspect rather than what the aspect is on some level, because what's happening is the two archetypes associated with the two planets are mutually activating one another. They're coming to some form of relationship. And the way we can understand it is primarily as a participatory phenomenon. I believe the human soul is incarnate at this moment in time, at Rudolf Steiner's birth moment at February 25th, 1861 at 11:15 p.m. And I discussed this with Rick a little bit. There's a discrepancy, I guess, as to whether he was born on the 25th or the 27th. And he is in contact with, I forget his name. I want to say Robert Palmer for some reason, but he's a Steiner scholar, and he's
Robert Powell, I think.
Robert Powell. Thank you, Matt. Then he is convinced that it's February 25th, not the 27th. And then he was baptized 2 days later on the 27th. So we're going with the 25th. And I think I'm just going to begin by describing a little bit the way I see the archetypal astrological perspective is primarily as a spiritual discipline. And in the same sense that Steiner is striving to cultivate a spiritual science with anthroposophy, I believe this can be a disciplined practice that ultimately we're engaging both our percepts and our understanding of the experience of archetypes and the concepts, which are the archetypes themselves in many ways. And it is through our thinking, also I believe our feeling and willing is to bringing forth the co-creative participatory relationship that's taking place. But it is through thinking that we can deeply engage with the archetypal beings and cultivate an ongoing relationship with them. And in relationship to the evolution of consciousness that described by Steiner, and by specifically, I think Barfield's really clear here, where it's, original participation, and then the Christ event is kind of bringing about an individuation process of the individual. And then Tarnas is really good here with the disenchantment of the cosmos that took place through the scientific revolution, the Copernican revolution, and the modern era, where we kind of differentiated and walled ourselves off from a sense of being in participation with nature, that we see ourselves as somehow fundamentally separate from it. And this seems to be an important part of what's taking place is in the forging of our autonomy, our individuality. But the astrological perspective can serve as a reuniting foundation, a principle, a methodology that helps us recognize how we are in participation. That the archetypes are mysteriously correlated to the planets as living symbols, And they're both in the world and they're in the human being, the human psyche, human soul. And it is through synchronicities correlated to our birth chart and to our transits that ultimately unite the inner and the outer, above and below, through meaning. And this can be the vehicle ultimately that helps us, or one of the vehicles that helps us cultivate a new relationship with the divine, with the depth of our soul, that wasn't possible before the evolution of consciousness and the individuation process that seems to be taking place. So I'll just leave that there. And I guess one other thing that is helpful here is archetypes can be understood as, Rick articulates this really well, in the sense of as primarily Homeric gods and goddesses. That was the original kind of vision in the Western tradition. And then Plato sees them as forms or ideas, or you can see them as Aristotelian universals, formal, efficient, material, and final causes, but also as Jungian psychological complexes, or how Hillman describes them as gods of the psyche. I think we can also understand them as, what Rick also says, is Freudian instincts or Darwinian instincts. Both have archetypal dimensions, but also as like Whitehead as eternal objects, or Rupert Sheldrake as morphic fields. I think also today we can understand them as quantum fields. It's interesting, Plato's original understanding of archetypes came from the Pythagorean mathematics and geometry, and our most current understanding of mathematics is quantum mechanics, as it reflects the material world. And I think like the fine structure constant, or the Planck's constant, or the speed of light, are archetypes as well. And they're informing and helping us understand the transcendent dimension of the phenomenal world and how it relates to us. Or as Steiner describes them, as spiritual beings. And I think what's happening is archetypes are all of these things. We can understand them at each different level, but what's reflected in the different thinkers' perception of them is the evolution of consciousness, how our understanding of archetypes is evolving through time. Maybe we'll just jump into Steiner's birth chart. So do you have any questions about anything I've said so far? Okay, we'll keep going. So in the astrological birth chart, what the foundational planetary archetypes are the sun and the moon. The sun is at 7 Pisces here, is the central part of our identity, in the sense of way we're striving to creatively enact our will in life and onto the world, or in participation with the world. The moon, on the other hand, is the child in us. It's the mother in us, and it's the mother-child dyad. And it is everyone's relationship, primarily or initially, first relationship we have is with one's mother, and the quality of that relationship becomes the template upon which the rest of our relationships are built. So how we feel about ourselves, whether we feel as though we belong to the world, is a function of the lunar dimension of who we are, whereas the sun is more the striving, creative identity and will, where we're the trajectory of life. The moon is the way you emotionally relate to people. If you feel familiar with someone, it's often a function of the lunar dimension of who we are. It can be the sun as well, but the moon is more of the subconscious or diffuse consciousness type of intuitive relational knowing. And it's really interesting in Steiner's chart is he has the sun in a T-square, it's called, with Saturn and with Uranus. This is this two red lines here. Saturn here at 6 Virgo, Uranus at 8 Gemini, and this is the T-square. It's called just what looks like a triangle, but it's actually one leg of a square. If you had another planet over here, it would form a full square with one opposition, or two oppositions and two squares. But the square is the 90-degree relationship. It's the thick red line. But then the moon, on the other hand, you can say it's in a wide conjunction with Saturn as well, but it seems primarily related in his psyche in many ways to this Mercury-Neptune conjunction. So he has Mercury and Neptune in a conjunction. They're in the same place, basically 25 degrees and 28 degrees Pisces. And these are really fundamental aspects of his psyche, in the same way that the sun and the moon are the real two core parts of our identity. And just to kind of go into it a little bit, the Mercury Neptune is the primary aspect that we really, I think, see in Steiner, which is his focus on thinking. The Mercury is the mind, the way we think, the way we communicate, the way we recognize patterns. It's the messenger of the gods, the communication principle. And Neptune is the ideal, in a sense. It's our spiritual aspirations, our dreams, the imagination. In some sense, the entire archetypal realm is Neptunian, in the sense like all the rest of the planets are kind of aspects of the Neptunian realm of the archetypal, the spiritual world. And this is the clairvoyant in him. What happens with Neptune, not only does it correspond to the spiritual realm, the ideal, but it tends to make more sensitive whatever it's in relationship with. It corresponds to the underlying unity of reality. And so whatever it touches, Mercury or the moon in this case, it makes those planetary archetypes, those aspects of our psyche, more porous, more open. This is like when Steiner says, you know, he doesn't see no limits to human knowledge. In a sense, that's reflective of his Mercury-Neptune conjunction, because Mercury is made porous and connected to the spiritual realm in a very unique way. Here, I'll point out Goethe's chart, who was a primary figure clearly for Steiner. And he has a Venus sextile Neptune in his natal chart. And Mercury is like the exact midpoint between Venus and Neptune. Neptune is like the poet. Venus is art, beauty. You see lots of poets with either Venus Neptune or Mercury Neptune or both. Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen are all Venus Neptune or Mercury Neptune people. But Goethe, having Mercury at exactly the midpoint, this is his capacity to have an intuitive knowing to the world, the sensory, where the Mercury, the mind, the capacity for perception is made more porous, and potentially seeing the archetypal ground or foundation of the phenomena that one is relating to. I don't know that much about Steiner's biography in particular. I mean, clearly the Mercury Neptune, like his focus on intuitive thinking as being like the highest form of thinking, the intuition you see with Neptune, it's the making more sensitive or more porous, the capacity to see beyond the boundaries of reality with Mercury. And with the moon is, like I was saying, the relational field, how we relate to the world. And both Mercury and the moon have a strong listening function. Like it's the perception, it's taking in the world in a way. And so like, I feel like, I'm guessing he was a very astute listener, both in his relational capacities and when he was giving so many lectures and that type of thing, that he's also listening to the audience. And that really reflects the moon Mercury Neptune kind of correspond relationship. Here comes Angus. Hi, Angus. Okay. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions at any point. Always in readings, don't hesitate to interrupt me if you have a comment or question or anything like that. So in addition to the Mercury Neptune, Moon Neptune, really important part of his psyche and orientation to the world, you see this really strong Sun-Saturn, Sun-Uranus T-square. And just to give it a keyword kind of understanding, the concept or the idea of ethical individualism is very much a Sun-Saturn, Sun-Uranus comet. The Sun-Saturn part of him is the orientation towards ethics. Saturn is the superego, our conscience, our sense of right and wrong. And it's the disciplined part of him that's really focused on science, on mathematics, on structure, on disciplined routines. When I was saying Neptune is the ideal world, the spiritual world, Saturn is the physical world. Saturn is the last planet you can see with the naked eye, and it represented the endings of things: Father Time, the Grim Reaper, death, mortality. But when Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were discovered in 1781, 1846, and 1930, it changed our understanding of Saturn in important ways, where Saturn became more the limit of the ego, or the limit of the physical world, and Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto pointed towards the transpersonal dimensions of reality. But you see with Sun, Saturn, or strong Saturn placements with people who have a strong disciplined moral focus, often like a strong work ethic routine. They work hard in life. They tend to shoulder responsibilities early in life. There's an orientation towards rigidity potentially. But then on the other side of this is Uranus, first planet discovered with a telescope, and it represents change, novelty, and freedom. It was discovered, like I said, in 1781, which is right in between the American and French revolutions, and it corresponds to revolution. Prometheus is the god really that archetypally fits the planetary archetype of Uranus, which Prometheus liberated mankind from the gods that didn't feel as though humanity was worthy of consciousness. And Prometheus stole consciousness, the fire, and gave it and liberated humanity. And you can see this as a strong impulse in Steiner's work. It's a disciplined focus, like exercises, these meditative disciplines that can lead to freedom, that can lead to emancipation, that can lead to a new understanding of the human in many ways. This is also the innovator. Like you see Uranus placements with genius often, and he was clearly a polymath, understood, like biodynamic farming, Waldorf education, the history of philosophy. I mean, there's so many different ways in which he was oriented in creative ways in the world. You also see the Saturn-Uranus alignments often with engineers and architects, because they're using like structure, Saturn, the physical world form, and novelty, new ideas, new possibilities, and bringing them together. Let's see. I think you can also see the Sun-Saturn aspect in his life, and maybe you guys can help me with this. It seems as though he was met with a lot of resistance to his ideas, that he had a difficult kind of people accepting his ideas. And Saturn is the no principle, resistance. It's like, it's the guardian of the threshold, in the sense, the taskmaster of life. And it requires the hard work and discipline and focused effort to pass the thresholds, to prove, in a sense, like the mathematics structure, the validity of one's ideas, that type of thing. I think in his writing, you can really see it in his tendency to carry the pole of doubt all the time. He's constantly kind of like saying, like, how one could not agree with his ideas, and then tries to lay that out. And that seems to be carrying that understanding of the recognition of the reality principle and how people might not agree, Saturn negative, with his ideas. And so he's trying to help you, not have resistance to his ideas by honoring the idea that there may be disagreements with his perspective. Is that making sense so far? Do you agree with that, Matt, about his like carrying the pole of doubt and the resistance to his ideas, that type of thing?
Yeah. You can hear in so many of his lectures the frustration at being misunderstood, and even starting lectures by saying that the things that I have to say using a language that evolved for the sensory world to try to describe something spiritual, almost of necessity, will be misunderstood, but I have to say it anyway. So there's like this frustration in his whole effort because of that. So yeah, I think you're hitting it right on the head.
Right on. And then there's
something about Saturn.
Please. What's that?
Could I say something about Saturn?
Please.
I was thinking about I'm not entirely sure about the dates, but it just occurred to me that I've read that Steiner encountered Kant around the age of 14, 15, 16. Can someone confirm that? And Kant is so Saturnian, isn't he not? And it's interesting, wouldn't that mean that he was coming, that Saturn would have been half, like 880 degrees
Exactly. Yeah, it was
when he was
actually,
15, and he would have
yeah,
encountered. Yeah, so I was just
exactly.
thinking of that.
Yeah, I was gonna point to that, not necessarily with Kant. I think I had heard that, but I wasn't. Um, but what I did read on Wikipedia was that he suggested by the age of 15 he had a complete understanding of the nature of time, which is also a Saturnian function. Like chronos is where we get the word chronology. Chronos was the Greek name for Saturn and Father Time, and that whole understanding. And it is the material world that's governed by time in essence, whereas Neptune is the timeless. The like his capacity to read the Akashic record or to have this clairvoyant capacity. This is the Neptunian timeless dimension, whereas Saturn is the structure of the world and the phenomenal world in time. And what I'm showing here is this is his natal chart on the inside that we were just looking at. And then these are where the planets were for July 1st, 1876, when he was 15 years old. And so Saturn was exactly what you're saying, Kate. It was opposite itself, and it was conjoining his sun at that time. So yeah, that's a great insight and comment on your part. Yeah. So, and that's basically, it seems to be what's happening is we're always in a participatory relationship with the natal chart. And then as the planets continue to move through the course of our life, it's a co-creative relationship, both with the natal chart and with the movements of the movements of the planets. So just a couple more things here before we go, because I do want to move on quickly to get to discussion with you guys and stuff. But he's born with a Mars-Pluto conjunction, which is in a really tight trine with Saturn. There's a lot you can say about this. He didn't, even though he was interested in astrology, from what I understand, he didn't have Pluto. Pluto wasn't discovered until 1930, 5 years after his passing. So this is a new principle, or the pantheon. It wasn't new as far as a phenomenon. We always had it, but we didn't know where it was in the planetary orbits. So Pluto is really crucial for the understanding of astrology, archetypal perspective. Like Richard Tarnas' book, Cosmos and Psyche, it's 4 chapters of evidence, 2 of which are used Pluto, Saturn and Pluto, and Uranus and Pluto. So like if Pluto hadn't been discovered, that book, well, it would have been completely different. It wouldn't have been the book that it is. But Pluto is really important for us understanding the id, the instinctual dimensions of life, like the Darwinian instincts, the Freudian id. This is the Pluto, corresponds to the archetype of Pluto. And he had Mars in a tight conjunction with it, trine to Saturn. And this, from what I can gather, was his just like robust energy. You see Mars Pluto with like mountain climbers and like boxers and long distance runners and people who have like a tremendous amount of resources, plutonic resources, energy, combined with the warrior principle, with our assertive capacity to take action. Just the number of lectures that he was giving, from what I was reading, and just constantly working, it's all in a trine to Saturn. Saturn is the work ethic, the disciplined approach. You see Mars Saturn often with like people who have really intense exercise routines, like where they're disciplined with their exercise. And with Pluto, it's a capacity to build. I think this is also the sculptor in him, the Mars Saturn. You see with Auguste Rodin is a Mars square Saturn person. He's, I guess, one of the most famous sculptors in history. And also Michelangelo also had Mars trine Saturn in his natal chart. And you see it with like massage therapists and stuff, that people who take their energy, their action in the world Mars, and it meets resistance. You see it with like construction workers and that type of thing, but it's sculpting as like this active principle. It's engaging with the phenomenal world, the material world, and sculpting it in a new way. So yeah, just to give you a couple examples there. But this, I believe, this is his strong, intense work ethic, Pluto, trine Saturn, but also the moral ground and the moral center and conviction of morality being like such an important piece of our evolution of consciousness task, and cultivating a more moral center of being, ultimately, so that one can be free. Here you can see again, this is the Sun-Saturn, the focus on discipline approach to one's conscience, that allows one to be free, ultimately, the Uranian principle on the other side. But yeah, from what Rick said once in a lecture, that he only slept like 4 hours a night, that he was just a constant working, and didn't sleep a lot. You see that with tremendous amount of resources in Mars Pluto energy. And that's also in a sextile to the sun. And then I should also say here that Pluto is in a semi-square to Mercury. So not only is Mercury in conjunction with Neptune, the clairvoyant orientation towards, the spiritual realms, the spiritual world, but it's driven by Pluto. You see Mercury, Pluto, people with like intense insight, penetrating insight, like capacity to go deep, like Pluto's the underworld, the instincts, the biological ground. And Mercury, Pluto people tend to be detective-like in their mind, like seeking deep. They often are profound readers, can read deeply, and also powerful communicators, like where they speak has a lot of potency and capacity for transformation of the world, in a sense, like our transformational ideas. And you see that, I think, reflected in his desire to bring anthroposophy and his spiritual exercises, so in a sense to transform the world in an important way. So yeah, he's a deep thinker, reader of philosophy, but also this mystic clairvoyant with a Mercury Neptune. Like both of those both of those archetypal complex seem very vivid in his life. And then I think that's the final thing I'll say, but the fact he has Jupiter here is at the midheaven. This is the career point in the chart. You see Jupiter with like a philosophical breadth. Jupiter is the largest planet physically in the solar system, and it archetypally operates that way. It's very expansive. It's the growth orientation towards larger wholes, towards going to the mountaintop to take in the breadth of vision, to see the world from a high place, to take on the whole nature of philosophy ultimately. And it's in an opposition with Venus. Venus is the goddess of love. Aphrodite values what we find beautiful in the world and of love. Like this is this expansive kind of orientation towards love, or love being kind of the ultimate redeemer of the world, in the sense that it's through love, and the love of our ideas, the love of each other, of the love of fellow humans, and of the divine, that is kind of the overarching guiding principle in many ways, it seems. I mean, just to kind of review a little bit, like the spiritual science orientation that is the Mercury Neptune, Moon Neptune, and the Sun Saturn, right? The Sun Saturn is the scientific approach, the disciplined approach, the striving to prove it through experiments or exercises, to have it be able to be seen by the world in a scientific way, that there's a methodology that can allow us to gain access to the spiritual world, that can ultimately free us, Uranus. It's the combination of these. And I think the little bit that I understand of his understanding of Ahriman and Lucifer, Ahriman seems to be more of a Saturnian figure, and Lucifer is the light bearer, right? The bringer of light. It's the struggle between those two. That's the square. And that, in a sense, the sun is the Christ principle, the self, in Jungian sense, the like with a capital S, that is the in between Ahriman and Lucifer, if I'm understanding his kind of conception of those figures and working with them. Yeah, does that make sense to you guys, as far as your understanding of just the last thing I said with Ahriman and Lucifer?
Yeah, I was just typing. I think you're right, but I'm curious what others think of this too, that it seems to me that there's a bit of a mix or hybridization in the archetypal qualities of Lucifer and Ahriman, and that Lucifer certainly has Uranian aspects, but I think Lucifer is also Neptunian, whereas Ahriman certainly has Saturnian aspects, but is also Plutonic. I wonder what others who are familiar with the archetypes think of that, but so you're right, but it's a little bit more complicated,
nuanced. Yeah, that makes sense. And that's something that Rick is really good on as well, which is, and Steiner, like the quote that I put in the volley, he was pointing out how archetypes never appear alone, that they're always in relationship to each other. It's not like Uranus is this solely separate thing. Uranus has Saturnian qualities. I mean, Saturn and Uranus, they they work together. Like you couldn't have one without the other. It's the senex and the puer. It's, you know, the capacity for freedom is built on the capacity to build solid foundations of autonomy, of selfhood, which is the Saturnian principle. The more, you know, work and disciplined approach to life is what Steiner's really pointing at. The more stronger foundations you build for selfhood and sovereignty, all Saturn things, the more freedom it provides for you. You know, they're constantly in a negotiation, and they're also, Uranus is always rebelling against the Saturnian restrictions, the contractionary nature of it, and the no principle, for more freedom and for novelty, whereas Saturn is about the past and traditional structures and that type of thing. So they're always part of this evolutionary dynamic, which is ultimately Plutonic in essence. Pluto is the evolutionary instinctual drive to life, to the evolution of consciousness, as well as to our individual lives, and to biology, to the biological organism as well.
Yeah, I mean, the more last thing I'll say is the more I think about it, the more I can see a Luciferic and harmonic quality to each archetype.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to try to translate these two
figures. Beings. Yeah.
What do others think about these correlations?
I would say, I mean, I think similar, Matt. I think when I first was getting into anthroposophy and trying to understand Lucifer and Ahriman, I was sort of quickly trying to map them onto, you know, the outer planet archetypes. But yeah, it seems like, well, especially because Steiner conceived of them as, you know, like individuated, not like they're actual like specific concrete beings, though also, you know, manifest in polarity. So they're like almost the archetypes are more general, I guess you could say. Anyway, those were some thoughts.
Yeah, that makes sense, Ashton. Yeah, I'm just skimming through your guys' comments in the chat. Okay, so I think we'll kind of run through some of his transits here. The first important event seems to be clairvoyant perception of his aunt who had committed suicide, which I guess the family wasn't aware of at the time, and that she walked into his father's engineering or conductor's office, you know, spoke to him that she needed, you know, him to help her through, you know, I guess the transition, and then she like walked into an oven. Basically I got that from Wikipedia or Gary Lockman interview, and it's basically when he was 9 years old. What's interesting to me is there's a double Saturn-Neptune alignment. Like Saturn in the sky is in a square to his Mercury-Neptune. So this is the clairvoyant part of his psyche, the Mercury-Neptune. And it's in a 90-degree relationship to Saturn, the mortality, death, the ending of thing. And Neptune in the sky is it's called a sesquiquadrate. It's 135 degrees to Saturn. I don't have the time of the year, but both of these transits would have been operative to 1 or 2 degrees that entire year, because they're so slow moving generally. I thought that was a pretty interesting correlation just for being 9 years old. The Saturn also a little earlier, maybe 22 Sagittarius, which would be in a square to his moon. So it's the lunar dimension, the family, a female figure who had passed Saturn, and the clairvoyant insight into her passing. But then what Kate mentioned was a really excellent point. And when he was 15, that he discovered Kant, and Kant being a very Saturnian figure, and Saturn conjoining his natal sun, and the Wikipedia said that he had a full conception or understanding of the nature of time at 15, which time, Saturn, Chronos, like I mentioned before, the chronology, and Father Time. And I mean, this is an important period for everyone. Basically, between 13 and 15, everyone goes through the Saturn opposition. It's a at the Saturn cycle, it's like the square happens between 6 and 8, the differentiation of the self between the parental family. And then at 13 and 15, it's puberty, and you're really separating, you're forging your own autonomy in a certain important way, and you're separating from the parental mold. And happens again between 20 and 22. You go off to college and you're just trying to find who you are and what you're going to do for your rest of your life, which the Saturn return often is when that you incorporate, they internalize the Saturn function in an important way, and you become an adult, and you often land the kind of career kind of idea or something, what your career path, like what you're going to work on for the next 30 years of your life, which is actually, we can just jump to that. It was in 1891 that he got his PhD, and this is the Saturn return. And a couple of things from 1882 is when he began the work on Goethe. And this was when Uranus it had just been opposing his natal sun and square to itself, which you see, this is also the second Saturn cycle as well. Saturn was moving into the square here. Newton discovered or formulated calculus during this period, to 21 to 22, 18 to 20, 22, with Uranus square, Uranus phase. And this is like his beginning of that kind of genius path of the insight into Goethe's work. It's interesting, yeah, also Neptune in the sky was in a really tight trine to his moon. And I think what's important here that we'll I think, because right after he gets the PhD, which I guess the PhD was Truth in Science or Truth in Knowledge, which became that book. Is that correct? Which was published in 1892.
That was his dissertation, you're saying? I think so.
Yeah, his dissertation. And I think because what's really profound here, as far as his transits, which I think lead right into the philosophy of freedom, which is in 1894. This is a Neptune-Pluto conjunction. This conjunction only happens every 500 years. And what's really unique about it is that you go back 5 cycles and you get to the axial period. So from the 6th century, or from 600 to 540 BC, roughly. So this is in 570. Interesting, it was with his natal Pluto, but this is the only time in written history when Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, the 3 most outer planets, were all in a triple conjunction with each other. And it's when basically the Buddha, Lao Tzu, Confucius, and the beginning of Thales and Pythagoras, the beginning of Greek philosophy, all came into existence during this time. So you can see like the Uranus liberates, and Neptune is the spiritual vision, and Pluto is the transformational depth. And then every 500 years since then, Pluto and Neptune make a conjunction, and it happens at the end of Greece, the beginning of Rome, just 84 BC, right before Christianity. And then it happens again at the end of Rome, 400, so at the beginning of the Dark Ages, and then right at the high medieval ages, 900. And then right at the beginning of the Renaissance, 1400, is a Pluto-Neptune conjunction. And then the next one occurred in 1880. So, and it happened to 1888, exactly. And it happened to be in conjunction with Steiner's natal Uranus and square to his sun. So he had the same 3 outer planets of the axial era aligning with his natal Uranus and natal sun when he wrote his dissertation and Truth and Knowledge and Philosophy of Freedom, which is in an essence striving to recover the original principle in important ways and bring it into humanity for the individual, for the solar self, for individual human being. Yeah, when I saw that, I was blown away, because basically this Pluto-Neptune conjunction, it's what seeds the postmodern era. It's when Nietzsche had, just prior to this, declared the death of God, and the new reality ultimately comes in, largely riding on relativity theory and quantum theory, which emerge right after this, or at in 1900, which, yeah, that'll be the next alignment actually in 1898, 1899. in 1900 is when Steiner actually began his first lectures for the Theosophical Society, which from what I understand is where he came out of the closet as a spiritual practitioner. Like from what I understand, his work up until then was really focused on scientific focus. And then he brings in the clairvoyant, mystical, enchanted kind of perspective at this time. And what's happening is Uranus in the sky is in opposition to his natal Uranus. Like when Freud discovered the nature of the unconscious, Uranus opposite Uranus, or when Galileo turned the telescope to the heavens and saw the moons of Jupiter, Uranus opposite Uranus, or when Newton wrote the Principia, Uranus opposite Uranus. The Uranus opposition is a time where often our real Uranian gifts or insights really come into flourishing in important ways. And this is where he really kind of brought that into culture for the first time. I guess in 1900, it was a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. This is actually the beginning of quantum theory in 1900 under this alignment. And it was opposite his natal Uranus, square to his sun, square to Saturn. Yeah, so that's the beginning of the Theosophical Society orientation or work. And then I thought it was interesting in 1913 is when he actually has a break with them. I guess this is when, or I guess it's 1912 or 1913, where I guess he has a disagreement with Annie Besant, basically founds the anthroposophy in response to leaving the Theosophical Society. And what's interesting is Saturn came into conjunction with Uranus, square to natal Saturn and square to the sun. And you often see with Saturn-Uranus periods as a transit, breakdown, sudden breaks, like Freud and Jung's break, Saturn-Uranus went over their moon. And you see it with divorces a lot. Like we just went through a Saturn square Uranus period, basically through the pandemic, which is also a Saturn-Pluto period, but the Saturn-Uranus lasted a little bit longer. But just the divisions, the civil wars, the amount of, civil strife, and the actual Civil War, 1861, that Steiner is born during, was a Saturn square Uranus period, you see, which he's born with as well. So that it holds a lot of tension between the past and the future, between regressive ideals and traditional conservative, ideals. You see a lot of disruptions and a lot of sudden, unexpected breaks. Sudden and unexpected is Uranus, the new planet, and the breakdown from the past is the Saturn principle. And this is where that happened for him personally in the relationship to the Theosophical Society, but also is what led to anthroposophy. I don't want to go on too much longer.
Are there any other dates that others would especially like to see some transit analysis of? While
Jonathan had one, and Kate, yeah.
The burning of the Goetheanum.
Yeah, that's actually what I was just about to type in. Yeah, let's see. It's interesting. There was a Mars Uranus. He's getting Uranus. This is kind of the opposite, where before Saturn was conjoining Uranus, the break from Theosophical Society. Uranus is conjoining his sun, but it's opposite his natal Saturn. So the sudden, unexpected loss of a structure, the Goetheanum, the building, but it's through fire. Mars is the warrior, the fire principle, Aries, and Uranus liberates that. It's in a square to his natal Uranus as well, but directly on his sun and opposite Saturn. I think that's the main signature I saw there. Yeah, that's the main signature I saw. And did you have a date you wanted to see, Jonathan? You mentioned his passing in a volley chat, which we can look at. Yeah, it's interesting. Saturn in the sky was crossing his ascendant, and it was opposite his natal Mars-Pluto alignment. And Saturn in the sky was square to his Saturn. Mars in the sky was square to his Saturn and square to the sun. So it's, in a sense, it's a double Mars-Saturn alignment. Saturn opposite Mars and Pluto. Saturn is mortality, the ending of things, and Mars, astrology doesn't predict death. It doesn't predict anything concretely. It predicts things archetypally, and it shows the archetypal quality of the events typically. So I don't know how he died. Wikipedia said that he was suffering illness-wise and frailty for a year and a half or so beforehand, although he kept doing many lectures, like 4 lectures a day, even right up to the end. But this would kind of indicate that he was suffering, that there was a pain involved in the passing. Do you know how did he actually die? What was the causes? Do we know?
He had what might be thought of as stomach cancer, though it was also theorized that he was poisoned, or that he was poisoned by the strife and pollution of sort of soul pollution of what was going on within the Anthroposophical Society, some might say as well.
Yeah, interesting. I did. Gary Lockman mentioned that there were attempts on his life, like maybe from the Nazis, or that there were assassination attempts. And you actually do see that with Mars-Pluto alignments. Like Gandhi had a Mars-Pluto conjunction and was assassinated. But you also see it like with warriors. Like Gandhi took on the entire English army. You know, that's the Mars warrior principle, and Pluto intensifying that. But it's interesting, like archetypes are both, I mean, the planetary alignments are both the way we participate and express them, but it's also the way we view, or the way the world sees us, or the way the world responds to us. So it works as a window, it's a two-way street. So both inward, outward, but also outward, inward.
Well, Saturn crossing his ascendant, to me, it feels like that. I mean, he obviously didn't want to die because he was working so hard against his illness and his frailty. But it's almost as if it's like the perfect, Saturn crossing your ascendant feels like the perfect boat into the next life. It's like he chose that moment, it seems to me. That's when you showed me that to me, it felt very, because it's ascendant, you know?
Right.
So it felt very, kind of cathartic for me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think also Uranus is moving into a conjunction with his Mercury-Neptune alignment. So it's kind of liberating his spiritual vision in some way. It's like liberating his entire work. It's also a Neptune-Jupiter conjunction, which is like the utopic vision, like potentially bringing the vision, expanding the vision. I don't know if it, you know, it's often when after people pass, their life's work comes into more florid fruition in many ways, and acceptance. It definitely happened with like Joseph Campbell, for example. But it's interesting. Jung and many people have noted how astrology works even after you pass. Like it continues to reflect how you were participating in the world. And Neptune is just now reaching, he's going through his Neptune return over the next several years. So Neptune's 165-year orbit. So Neptune has only gone around the zodiac once since he was born. It's now returning to his natal Mercury Neptune alignment, which is, I don't know, it's fitting for us studying his work at this time, but it would be great to see more of his ideas come into more flourishing, you know. But I remember Alex mentioning like how anthroposophy is kind of reaching roadblocks, or it just hasn't had like a lot of continued flourishing in many ways. Jonathan, did you want to see the January 1st and describe that event?
Yes, please.
Okay, so Jonathan wrote to me the January 1st, 1924. Yeah, please, you describe it, Jonathan.
Can you hear me? I'm not sure if this mic works.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was the end of what's called the Christmas conference, which was his last kind of big effort to help the society that was forming around him to really become effective, you know, as a body rather than just people, individuals. And it was a moment where I mentioned it in the last Zoom we had, where he had to make this decision because as somebody who had a certain sort of level of initiation, one was never to do something unless asked, and never to join like membership to, I guess you could call it a sort of a secular organization. One could be, so he always, he was never a member of the Theosophical Society or something like that, but he would speak to them and from out of his own experience and research. But at that point, he closed that conference and he had made the decision to join the society and to become the leader of the society. So not just to be a sort of a teacher and inspiration to people who would do that, but to sort of fully step down with, because I think the sense I get is the spiritual world, we could say, was relying on him to get a lot out that we need, because that there weren't that many other sort of people who could do that. So there was quite a lot on his shoulders, and so normally he would have to sort of stand aloof to be a more sort of pure, not to get sort of muddied in worldly affairs, to be a more pure communicator of these things. But he made the decision that he was going to do this, and my understanding is that there was no recognition from the universe that whether this would be okay or not. It was a completely new move that he made. And so the end of the conference is a sort of the moment that I've chosen, not knowing exactly when he maybe signed a piece of paper to, become a member. I just chose that moment at the end of the conference where he finishes the last lecture, the last, sort of part of the program, saying this could be a new turning point in time. And obviously, every time you do something new and original, it's kind of a turning point in time, but this would be, I think, a particularly significant one. And then apparently about a few months later in Paris, and then shortly after that in Arnhem, in his lectures, or just before, at those places, he said, I sort of more or less as a side, I can confirm that the spiritual world was able to respond to the deed that was done. And now there's even more available as such. So I thought that would be an interesting point to kind of try and capture astrologically, if possible. And I don't know, I've just chosen what I imagine is the end of that lecture when he said this could possibly be a turning point in time.
Gotcha.
I don't know exactly when the lecture would have ended. I'm guessing 8:15 because it started at 8.
Gotcha. Yeah. The time it would only really affect the moon's position, which would have been conjoining Saturn and his ascendant, and opposite Pluto during that several hour period. But Jupiter in the sky was in a 1 degree square to his natal sun and an exact opposition to his Uranus. The Jupiter Uranus is like the new possibility, new awakening, new turning point, that kind of thing. And yeah, like that it was moving. Jupiter was also moving into a square with Uranus in the sky. Yeah, I think that does fit the new possibility, the new turning point. Jupiter Uranus, the history of scientific discoveries and the space race and history of flight, that type of thing, is a Jupiter Uranus, part of the Jupiter Uranus cycle. And I think this is also when what I read in Wikipedia was actually when he developed biodynamic farming, was late. It was in 1924, like the year before he passed, because he was asked by farmers to come up with a new, non-pesticide regimen farming technique. And I always kind of consider that part of his Saturn Pluto, like Mars Saturn part of his chart, like the earthly, like you're saying, the sculptor, it's like getting in the ground and doing the work with biology, with the foundational fecundity, Pluto, libido of the world, the biological nature of the world. And Saturn is moving into an opposition with that part of his chart, bringing it into substantial manifestation and to a new incarnation. Saturn has a lot to do with incarnation itself. It really reflects that orientation towards biodynamic farming as well.
Okay.
Those are the major events I have listed. Is there anything else anyone else wants to share? I'm unable to really see the chat here.
Chad, could we go back and look at the burning of the Gertianum chart?
Yeah.
And I can't remember exactly if this is just my imagination or if I read Steiner say it, but that, you know, with the first Gertianum, in some sense, his etheric body was bound up with that building.
Oh, interesting.
Made of wood. Right. And with Uranus and Mars going across his sun, and the sun being his life energy. I mean, that's its etheric being.
Right.
And so it really just struck me as that resonance is just so plainly evident in this transit.
Yeah, and the opposition to Saturn, like with the sense of loss, like just the loss of you know, sudden, unexpected, but just potentially devastating loss. Very, very fitting for that signature. Yeah.
The sculptor Sijith Marion, who worked with him on the representative sculpture and other things, was also very bound up with the body of the building, one might say. And she died fairly shortly after.
This statue, the representative of humanity.
Yes. Yes.
Have you seen that, Chad?
Yeah.
Luckily it was not in the building yet when it burned. It was just beside it somewhere, I think. But I think I mean, you could see that sculpture as like Steiner's natal chart express, but it's the whole structure of the cosmos, but expressed through Steiner's lens.
Right. Yeah, there it is, I think.
Such a shame. It should be up on the stage. That was where it was to be, and they've never put it up there.
It's down in the basement, right? And it's like,
yeah, it's a real shame. It's because that would be there every time one spoke in that building. That would be behind you, and everyone would be seeing that. It would be fantastic.
Yeah, and you can see this as like the Sun-Uranus liberated human being, kind of the Christ principle. And then Saturn, or like this is Ahriman and Lucifer, right?
Yes.
As also the Saturn-Uranus T-square in his chart, and it's all brought into relief through the Mars trine Saturn, the sculpting of, you know. Yeah, I was reading that he not only did he design 17 buildings architecturally, but he was involved in carving a good bit of the Gertianum as well, like personally, lots of little aspects of it.
It's funny when you look up Rudolf Steiner on Google, it says Austrian architect. I mean, interesting, but that's what he said on Wikipedia. That's what he's called.
Right. What's interesting about his natal chart in certain ways is everything is in really tight alignment with something, you know. There's nothing that's really like because some charts, like actually Whitehead's chart, it's interesting. He has Neptune unaspected. It's at the midpoint of Mars and the Sun, but it's interesting. He's born just 2 weeks before, 10 days before Steiner is. He has Mercury opposite Saturn and square Uranus. Like you see the Mercury Saturn signature with mathematicians often. Newton was a Mercury Saturn person, as was Einstein, and with scientists like science. Saturn is a scientific structure and orientation towards, you know, proving reality and through consensus, or proving the nature of things through consensus. Saturn is the consensus reality, and Mercury is the mind, the thinking. And Uranus is the novel. I mean, clearly Whitehead was both a genius mathematician and new ideas, new understandings. But it seems like this Sun Mars midpoint with Neptune being there, he was like a spiritual warrior in ways that were perhaps hidden and weren't like up front as much in that part of his life where math was more the central focus. What do you think about that, Matt? As far as
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that's Neptunian about Whitehead's philosophy. I mean, the role of the imagination and the sense of preserving a kind of Platonic world of ideas, but bringing it, even more, making it even more kind of unified with the physical experiential world. But but it's not really explicit in his work so much as is the precision and the mathematical dimension of it that's more on the surface, which makes it difficult for all of us, myself included, to penetrate his thought, because it can be so abstract and requires such a high degree of conceptual rigor and so on. Right. But he's doing it in novel ways too, with that square with Uranus. So, and the Moon, Pluto, Mars stuff. He was a star rugby player.
Trine Saturn,
in high school. Yeah, Trine Saturn. And when you look at pictures of him as like a 19, 20-year-old, he looks like vicious, like
stout.
He would take you out if you had, if you had the ball in hand.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I have never seen film of Rudolf Steiner, but the pictures, he seems like there's a certain rigidity I perceive in him, like a certain strong Saturn that's got. Did you want to say something?
Well, just that there's pictures of Steiner looking very, very Sun-Saturn,
very serious,
like overworked, exhausted, serious. And then there's other pictures of him kind of smiling and warm, and you really see the Jupiter Venus.
Jupiter Venus.
And so he has these two basic moods. I think it depends which photo you get.
Yeah, I haven't seen the Jupiter Venus photos, I don't think.
I can, there's some.
Yeah, it's interesting with Whitehead, like I don't know if this is appropriate or not. I thought it's really fascinating that in 1927 this is the founding of quantum theory in many ways at the Solvay Congress, and this Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, it was present at the beginning of the birth of quantum theory in 1900, but then during this conference, this is when what's interesting, it was on this Jupiter-Uranus conjunction was in opposition to Niels Bohr's Jupiter-Uranus. Niels Bohr is born with a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. This was in alignment with his Jupiter-Uranus, but it was on Einstein's Mercury-Saturn alignment. So like for Einstein, the world was collapsing, like his orientation towards determinism, towards a Saturnian predetermined understanding of the nature of reality, or without the uncertainty principle kind of thing, was collapsing for him. But for Niels Bohr, it was like a revelation. It was right up right in his wheelhouse. But I thought it was really striking that for Whitehead, it was on his Neptune. And it seemed like he's the person that really recognized the spiritual dimension of what was being revealed by the essence of quantum theory, the indeterminate, the principle of complementarity, and how it was fluid and it was a process relational dimension. But then, how do you just see that, Matt, as far as like it opening up his metaphysics in a certain way, or was that already really happening?
No, absolutely. Quantum physics opened up and really made him more interested in metaphysics. But I think all the originators of quantum theory were all like this. Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Bohr. They were deeply mystical, and they're all idealists basically. So it's not like Whitehead's unique in that respect.
Right on. Yeah, so it just points back to the Neptunian dimension ultimately of the mystical experience and the connection to the archetypal realm, which is really what Steiner really brought to us with his Mercury-Neptune alignment. It's interesting, I didn't mention it before, but Thomas Aquinas also had a Mercury-Neptune conjunction. It's in a trine with Pluto and with Jupiter. But didn't Steiner intimate that he may have been a reincarnation of like Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting that Aquinas had the Mercury Neptune as well.
Yeah, Aquinas is not called the angelic doctor for nothing. Let me look at that chart.
Oh yeah, Jeff actually mentioned it here back a while back. I'm sorry, what did you say, Matt?
Well, just one of Thomas Aquinas's nicknames is the angelic doctor.
Mm.
And he's like, basically his intellect is angelic. I mean, and the way the cosmos prepared for his incarnation is like right there.
Yeah, right. I mean, these amazing grand trines. He has one square, Moon Jupiter square. But yeah, Moon, Saturn, Mercury, grand trine really tight. Neptune, Pluto, and Jupiter with the Sun and Mars. Spiritual warrior again. Mystical orientation, and Uranus, Neptune as well. I mean, the whole chapter on Uranus, Neptune, and Cosmos and Psyche is all about the spiritual revelatory periods in history. So he's born with that alignment as well.
And all Earth as well. It's so interesting. And like mostly Earth.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, very grounded. Yeah, the doctor, like bringing it into manifestation, bringing it into form.
Mm.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, so is there anything else? I'm sorry I wasn't able to read the chat. Yeah, I wasn't seeing that through the.
No worries. Yeah, I have to run in a minute, but if other folks
me
want to
too.
stay on, you should keep going.
No, I actually have
do
a
hope you
reading
share this too.
later. Yeah,
online.
yeah, I think so. Thank you everyone for your presence, your comments, your insights.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. Really, so valuable, such a helpful contribution to bring this, the astral timing of all this, and to say in one way, helps put things in context.
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe the last thing I'll say is I've had a lot of criticisms of Steiner through the readings and stuff. I feel like chapter 9 really helped me relax a lot of that. But the idea of like pure freedom is still challenging for me. And like, because I was also reading that he feels like you can get outside of your karma on some level through real disciplined action and stuff. But I don't think that we can transcend the birth chart, you know?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Like, where's freedom in all this? How do they relate? It's fascinating.
Well, I do think the more awareness we bring to our understanding of our archetypal complexes, the more freedom we have, the more will and agency we apply to it, the more the relationship can unfold as a dialogue, as a process with our agency involved with it, rather than being unconscious of it in a sense. And that's the whole depth psychology project, is to make the unconscious conscious. So it allows us to see unconscious dimensions of our complexes, our psychological complexes, and come into a relationship with them, which frees us in certain ways. But I don't think that there was ever a time that Steiner was not a Mercury Neptune person, you know,
Right.
that everything he was thinking wasn't channeled through that complex, you know.
His astral body, his astrology, his chart is his astral body, which is his characterological disposition. He is always going to be that Mercury Neptune person, but the I is free from that. That's how I see it. You will always have that astral body in that lifetime, which was created out of the birth chart, but the I is directly connected to the spiritual world.
And yet, if whatever you do, say any momentous event you do, one can track the chart of that in relation to the natal chart, which we've been doing, and go, oh yeah, that completely makes sense that happened then. Do you see what I'm saying? So
yeah. I mean, it's all what we mean by freedom.
Yeah,
it's not the freedom to go against the creative impulse of the cosmos. It's the I's freedom is to love that creative impulse.
But then, is there a moment like, so one might be fully conscious and love that impulse, but then that karma's gone. When is the moment when the new karma could be formed? And you know, that is that the point of freedom?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. Like I feel like I don't know if karma can ever be like dissolved. It's still your karma. You can move into new relationships with it, I believe, you know. But you can't erase anything that we've done. Like you can't even remove any experience that you've ever had.
No, but you can, wherever you are up to now, you can turn left or right. And if
Yes.
when we look at the chart, we can say, oh well, obviously he turned left at that moment because the chart shows that all fits. Where is the moment?
It's more archetypal than that, because left and right are too concrete in a sense.
Okay.
And I think the will, in the agency, the I think like what you're saying, or the soul, Kate, like it is, I think, in a sense, free of the chart, in the sense that it has incarnated through many charts, through many lifetimes, and in that sense is not in an absolute beholden way to it. But I also don't think that our incarnation in this lifetime, our soul that is incarnate in this physical organism, actually can transcend the chart in any absolute way. I think there maybe are degrees of freedom with the more agency and more will and more awareness, more consciousness we bring to the relationship, allows for more freedom, so that we're less possessed by the archetypal complexes, we're less beholden to them, less puppet-like. But I think it's degrees of freedom related to our karma, our awareness, our will, our capacity to act.
If there's all these stars or planets, and their relationship, say, determines me, at what point do I become a major factor in that relationship? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so I'm not just determined by all that, but I'm one of the points that is also determining all the rest of the relationships.
I think at all times, personally, I mean, even when we're infant children, there's still, the soul is participating in its own unique way, because there are many like people born at exactly the same time and same place. They have exactly the same birth chart. It happens in New York, Tokyo, Mexico City every day. And they're not, it doesn't produce the same person. It's how that individual soul is participating in the dynamics, the archetypal dynamics at that time through the course of its life. But there's so many other factors of karma, of soul, and your relationship with your parents, which have different charts for all those charts. You can't escape it. You can't transcend it fully. I think the more awareness through the evolution of our individual life, the more consciousness we cultivate and develop as we individuate, helps to negotiate that relationship. And the more we understand about it, the more freedom is possible to cultivate, but that there are large karmic factors and consciousness factors, awareness factors that are at play as well.
Can I offer a train of thought for me around astrology and determinism versus the role that the individual plays in freely enacting the future? Steiner says that the I is only possible on the earth, and astrology is only possible because we can take the perspective as if the earth were at the center.
Yeah.
And so the I's relationship, each I's individual relationship to their natal chart, is not a determining factor in that I's freedom, but the freedom that I has, I think, does in some way require loving their own karma meaning their natal chart and their situation. You have to love your situation, and when you do that, you're not free of karma, but karma becomes, you just recognize what karma is. It's your action. So when someone else harms you, if you're in love with your karma, you're not going to say fuck you. You're going to say, that's me.
Right.
That's me.
Yeah.
And so but you can't act freely until you know that. You can't act freely until you love your karma. And so loving your natal chart is not saying I'm just a victim of my fate. It's saying
Right.
that's me.
Yeah,
Right?
like Nietzsche says, what the love of fate, or fatia more, or or the concept of the eternal recurrence or eternal return. Is that basically the same thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Nietzsche's version of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree that with that. It resonates with me. Yeah. That in and of itself provides a degree of freedom that doesn't exist without it. And I think that's what's interesting about the whole Christian mythos, in a sense, is that it's the will to believe, to have faith, to love the divine, to move into relationship with it. That's at play. It's not just that the Jews are connected. It's just that we have the choice. We've been given the freedom to move back into relationship with what we have individuated from in an important way, and that it is up to us. It's up to our love and will and agency to cultivate that relationship.
How is that different from Spinoza's mechanoid universe?
Well, to me, I don't know Spinoza very well, but it seems absolutely different in the sense that its choice is based on free will rather than it just being as is, right, Matt?
How different is it from Spinoza? Maybe not all that different, except that, in some sense, there's truth in the idea that every great philosopher is saying the same thing in a different way. Right. And I don't want to erase
better way. We hope.
I think what Spinoza doesn't have that I would want to add in addition to his brilliant understanding of the relationship between the soul and the world and God is a sort of sense of creative evolution and contingency that I think is essential to the beauty of existence. Contingency in the sense that, like,
this is like what Chad's speaking of, free will.
Yeah, that even the divine is caught up in the creative advance in some sense, right? And this is like my Whiteheadian side, where I don't want the divine to be excarnate, but involved in a process that isn't decided in advance, right? And I don't know that there's room for that in Spinoza. Maybe there is, but I haven't found it yet.
I don't know.
Yeah, I've always. Please, Alex.
Yeah, I was thinking, would that mean that these archetypes are evolving in our participation with them?
Yes.
So that
I think so.
the freedom is not necessarily ours in the sense that we're trying to find a freedom that we possess, independent from the archetypes, but the freedom is, I don't know, but in between, or I mean, you don't need to attribute the freedom to something.
It's freedom with. It's freedom with.
I love it. Yeah.
Be more like that. Yeah. And
absolutely.
the more conscious we become of our natal chart, the more we are able to move these archetypes forward in the sense of a conscious evolution.
Yeah, that's my sense of it as well. And yes, they I believe they evolve with us. I had that idea like probably 10 or 15 years ago when I was first really listening, right midway through my education with Rick Tarnas. And I asked him after class one day, I was like, so are the archetypes evolving with us? Like, not, they're eternal and unchanging the way Plato describes? And he was like, yes, that's a new kind of understanding of the way archetypes work. And he's been more explicit with that more recently and over the years now, in the past 5 or 10 years. And yeah, I believe what's happening is that everything we do, and not just us, it's everything that the entire world does, it participates in the archetypal realm as a kind of backdrop. And I don't think the way that Steiner quote that I didn't share it with the group, but I shared on Volley, but he describes it like a shadowy imitation. It's kind of Platonic, like it's just an imitation of the archetypal realm. I don't think that's what's happening. It's a novel instantiation. It's a novel participation that every person, everything, every phenomenon is participating in a new way, a unique way, evolving the archetype itself in its novel creative will and action. But that will, that act, like the concrescence, I guess, in Whiteheadian terms, as it happens, then becomes a superject, and that superject gets deposited back in the archetypal realm, which then continues to evolve. So every new generation, every new phenomena is reflective of everything that's also occurred within that archetypal realm. So they're evolving on maybe subtler levels than our kind of fast evolution. Please, Matt.
Yeah. Well, Whitehead says, time casts the shadow of truth back upon eternity. Time casts the shadow of truth back upon eternity and enriches it.
Exactly.
Right.
Enriches it in the archetypal realm. Yeah, it gets deposited there, it remembers. And that's, I think, what's ultimately happening is there's a unified, singular intelligence, it seems, that is remembering everything that everyone does all the time. Every thought, every action, everything that's ever occurred in the history of the phenomenal world of the universe pays attention to it. And that's why your transits work. It's why it reflects your karmic relationship. Everything we've done, your participation, it's being reflected back to you in symbols and synchronicities in your life that have been stored by this intelligence. And it's the whole effort, I think, is to striving to bring us into more awareness, into a higher evolutionary understanding and relationship with the divine itself. Rick has often mentioned that it seems to be creating a partner in us as a part of the universe, part of the cosmos that is seemingly separate, but not that, but they can cultivate that relationship because of this seeming sense of individual identity. Please, Matt.
This is in Steiner's words, this is, I mean, the archetypal realm for Steiner would be the angelic hierarchies, and they're kind of cultivating in the human being the capacity to join them as the fourth hierarchy. I mean, it's like Steiner's way of talking about this, but that gives, just like, you know, you would want to, and Jung would want to, like, the archetypes are not just abstract principles, they're gods and goddesses and beings that have a moral mission that we are involved in.
That's my sense of it.
Yeah.
And I feel like chapter 9, he just, like, here it is, the will, the moral tact, and then your intuitive thinking is all part of the evolutionary process, cultivating this moral or center, moral orientation towards the world.
Yeah. Well, I have to run. This has been such a gift. Thank you, Chad, and Kate, Jonathan, Alex.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, don't let me call this quits if you guys want to stay, but I have to go.
I have to go, actually. I have a reading in an hour and a half, and I really should prepare for it.
I should probably get to, yeah. Thank you, Chad. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. See everyone.
Thank you, Chad.
Very welcome.
Good to see you all.
Thank you all.
See you next Thursday.
Yeah, look forward to it. Bye, everyone.